So I'm talking tonight about America's marriage divide. And I think when you're sort of thinking about marriage today and what's sort of happening to marriage today, if you're like me, you might become a little confused. If you're just kind of standing in the checkout line at your local grocery store, scanning the cover of In Touch or People magazine to kind of see the latest, you might be forgiven for thinking that marriage is in trouble in the elite precincts of America. So from Brangelina to the Kardashians, from Jeff Bezos to Anthony Weiner, things look pretty rough in the marriage department, it might seem, among the rich and famous. But if you kind of start looking at this issue more seriously, what you see is that the privileged and powerful in America are actually doing pretty well. Jeff Bezos is an outlier. He's not kind of, the norm. So what we're actually seeing in America is that we're increasingly separate and unequal when it comes to marriage by class. So college-educated and more affluent Americans tend to enjoy relatively high quality and stable marriages. By contrast, working class and poor Americans are more likely to be struggling in the family department. They're more likely to be moving in and out of relationships, more likely to be having single-parent families dominate the lives of their children. And then, of course, they're facing the economic and social fallout of this family instability as well. So again, this is kind of the marriage divide that I'm talking about tonight. And I kind of give you a picture of what this looks like. I've got a few slides kind of just illustrating the demographic trends here. And what they show us is that when it comes to marriage, for instance, who is married? Again, the folks who are kind of in the upper half of the distribution are typically married, whereas working class Americans just below that middle spot are not, a majority of them are not married. And of course, people who are poor in America are the least likely to be married. When it comes to divorce, there's a pretty dramatic difference in marital stability, as this slide here tells us. What we can see is that across the country there's been a decline in divorce since the 70s, but that decline has really been most dramatic for college-educated Americans on the right here of this slide. And what you can see here also is that they are much less likely to get divorced compared to Americans who've got a high school degree or some college in the middle, or Americans or high school dropouts here on the left of the slide. So again, what this is sort of showing us is that marital stability is much, much more common for college-educated Americans and for affluent Americans more generally as well. So again, Jeff Bezos is an outlier in this regard. And then when it comes to non-marital childbearing, having kids outside of wedlock, some of you may remember that there was a pretty big to-do back in the early 1990s about a television character named Murphy Brown, this woman who was a kind of a well-educated, professional, affluent lady having a child on her own. Well, in the real world, Murphy Browns are comparatively rare. What this is showing us is that the vast majority of kids who are being born to more educated and affluent households are being born to women who are married. And sort of the dramatic growth in non-marital childbearing has been really focused much more among working class and poor Americans in recent years. Now, for me, kind of all these trends are important because they impact our nation's children. Okay, so this class divide that we're talking about tonight is particularly important in my estimation because what it leads to is a situation like the one here. This is a figure from Robert Putnam's most recent book on kids. Putnam is a professor of political science at Harvard. And what it shows us here is that kids who are being raised in less educated homes, homes headed by a high school educated parent, are much more likely to be raised today in a single parent home. Whereas kids with college educated parents are still today being raised in two-parent homes. And if you look carefully at this particular slide, you can kind of see that the blue line begins to bend downwards in around 2000, okay? So what this is telling us is that I think a lot of college-educated Americans kind of began to realize, in the late 80s, 1990s, that kind of their dalliance, if you will, with the divorce revolution, with sort of experimenting with alternative lifestyles when it comes to the family, wasn't particularly prudent or wise, or in some cases even principled. And so again, what's interesting here is that I think we've seen that college-educated, more affluent Americans have in many cases become much more marriage-minded, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. So the bottom line here is that when I'm thinking about kind of the demographic story, is that the United States is devolving. Not evolving, it's devolving into a separate and unequal family regime where the highly educated and the affluent enjoy strong and stable families, basically, and everyone else is consigned to increasingly unstable, unhappy, and unworkable ones. That's sort of the trajectory that we're on right now. It's obviously a sobering one for us as a country.